All right, welcome everybody in person and online to this latest Growth Lab Development Talk. My name is Tim O'Brien. I'm a Senior Manager of Applied Research here at the Growth Lab. And let me remind you what Development Talks is. It's a series of conversations with policymakers and academics working on economic growth and development in countries, regions, states, and cities in the US and around the world. The seminar is meant to provide a platform for practitioners and researchers to discuss both economic growth and development and analytical work centered on policy. I'm really excited for today. Terrance Smith, who is the Chief Innovation Officer for the City of Baltimore, is both a researcher and a practitioner. And I think you'll find his insights on both sides of that equation really powerful. I'm going to get us started first with some Growth Lab views and background before I hand it off to Terrance to share on his work, I think particularly on vacant housing in Baltimore. So first, before we go to that, let me give you a quick Growth Lab look at Baltimore. You know, at the Growth Lab, we do a lot of analytical work to try to understand how economies function, what problems they face, what binding constraints are preventing them from performing better. And Baltimore is a city, of course, so it's useful to show you a couple of slides I borrowed from Ricardo here on how we think about cities at the Growth Lab. One way to think about cities is like crystals. Like a crystal, a city forms around an initial seed. Think of that seed could be a resource, a mining resource, or some other thing, something that is there in the place that causes people to come there, utilize that resource, and sell things outside of the place. Those things they sell outside of the place are exports. And as people are generating exports in that place, it creates demand for non-tradables, which creates more jobs. And people move in to that place, both to work in the export sector and the non-tradable sector. As the export sector is growing, the demand for non-tradables grows. In good cases, this can kick off a process of agglomeration. In our words, in our parlance, places learn to create new words and longer words. They diversify as more people move in and more diverse know-how enters. As the place grows, it attracts more investment, more things happen, more diversification. And if it continues to export and export new things, that creates more demand for non-tradables and continued growth. To a point like a crystal, where if you were to remove the initial seed, you'd still have the city, even in the absence of that initial spark. So you could ask the question of what happens when the seed goes away in different contexts. Some places achieve this virtuous cycle. I believe this is a picture of Denver at some point in time, and it looks quite nice. Denver's a place that originally formed around its mining resources and then became something much bigger and different. And places can also suffer existential shocks. This is a picture, I believe, of a view of Detroit, which experienced an existential shock in the dynamics of the auto industry. Another way we think about cities is as fundamentally as labor markets, places where people are matching with jobs and industries. It's also useful to think of cities as small and very open economies, in that people are free to move in and out, much more so than in a country where it's a little harder to cross borders and migrate. In cities, you're free to come in if things are going well, and you're free to leave if things are not going well. So I won't go into the supply and demand graphs because I know that's not what you came here for, but you can use them in a way to develop some kind of signals of what's happening in different cities, depending on movements of the supply and demand curve. So based on that idea, we've been working on a flagship report on cities and diagnosing cities, and come up with some frameworks like this one of identifying what typology your particular city is in and how to think about the problems that you face. We've also been developing a diagnostic tree for use of cities based on kind of these principles. And last year we got a chance together with the Bloomberg Center for Cities to, in a way, pilot use of this new diagnostic approach with several different cities here. who I think have been finding it useful. We did not yet get a chance to really apply this on the city of Baltimore, but we had some initial reflections that I thought I'd share just to give some wider framing to what Terrance is going to share. So on the graph on the left here, it shows all the biggest cities in the US colored by their region. And on the x-axis, it's showing their change in population in the first decade of the 2000s, and on the y-axis, the second decade of the 2000s, up until COVID. And you can see Baltimore is in this quadrant where it's lost population in both decades. It's one of few large cities in the US that's been behaving this way. And most of the other cities in this box are Midwestern cities. The other red ones there are actually Buffalo and Pittsburgh, which you could also kind of think of as Midwestern cities. But the graph on the right, which maybe can't read so well, but that's from our Metroverse tool. And it's showing the different industry presence in Baltimore, where it kind of overperforms versus peer cities and where it underperforms. And might be surprising, in contrast to those Midwestern cities, Rust Belt cities, Baltimore is not intensive in manufacturing, at least not anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. It is very intensive in things like public administration, healthcare, education. So it's not quite a story of just a Rust Belt city adapting to a shock to manufacturing. I also want to give you some kind of spatial views on Baltimore here. The map on the left shows Baltimore City, roughly outlined. And the graph on the map on the right shows Baltimore City as that small part on the bottom. And then the wider red dashed line is Baltimore County. And it's important to recognize that Baltimore City is not an administrative unit within Baltimore County, but they're separate and distinct administrative units. These are maps that you can get from the Census Department, dot maps that show the racial composition of anywhere in the US. So they're pretty interesting to play around with. It's roughly the same view here on the left of Baltimore City. And you can see something here that people in Baltimore talk a lot about, which is like the white L and the black butterfly. And the spatial makeup of the city is very divided in that way, and it shows up in all sorts of indicators. So within this rough L shape, it's generally wealthier, a lot more white. White population is represented with brown dots here, and black population is represented with the yellow dots. And then you can see the wider view on the other side, and there's where Baltimore City is. And when we looked at population change more closely in Baltimore, we realized that it's not really a case where people are leaving the region of Baltimore, but it's much more a case where people are leaving the city of Baltimore, but the population of the county and other surrounding counties is growing. So it's more like a reorganization of people there, which is important for our diagnostic thinking. So an idea that we have just kind of put out there is we can also map where businesses are in Baltimore. So treat businesses as B. This is a map now of businesses based on Dun & Bradstreet data. And think of the dots on the map that I've been showing you as households, H. You can think of a little bit of a spatial model of Baltimore City now, again with the L, as a collection of households and businesses. And some of those businesses are tradable, and some of those businesses are non-tradable. And on the left, there's a very compelling graph of homicide rates over recent years in Baltimore. And many of you probably know that Baltimore's had some pretty spectacular success in the last couple of years in bringing down the homicide trend. And you can see that with these lines coming down. So one way we were thinking about Baltimore is before that turnaround, so call it up until 2023, it was facing a lot of shocks to its amenities, to its quality of life. And as a result of those shocks to its quality of life, people were leaving, households were leaving. As households were leaving, that also reduced the demand for non-tradable businesses. So many of those shut down. They didn't leave because they're there to serve the people who are there. And that's another shock to the quality of life there. So more households leave. And then it's possible that so many households were leaving that it became a problem for its tradables, for attracting talent for its tradable industries. So its tradable industries started to leave, or some of them began to shut down. But what we've been curious about is, since this turnaround in many areas of performance in the city, like homicides, are things turning around? Are households coming back in? Are tradable businesses coming back in? And where in particular are they coming in? And how is this affecting some of the legacy of, you might call it trauma, affecting the city, like with its vacancy problems? So we didn't get a chance yet to work on a large-scale project with the city of Baltimore, but we did get a chance to send an intern there last summer, Michael Hines, who I saw earlier. And Michael was sent to the city of Baltimore to work on something related to vacant housing, to make himself useful. And Terrance here, I'd say, stepped up to host him and match him and figure out how to make best use of his capabilities. So that's all just a little bit of introduction to how we got to know Terrance and his work. And I'll hand it over to Terrance now to speak about, hopefully a little bit about what he did with Michael, but also about much wider insights.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you all for having me. It's been an honor and a privilege to work in the city of Baltimore. It's also been an honor and a privilege to connect with Harvard Kennedy School, both through the Growth Lab and through the People Lab. I just find that, this space is such a facilitator of knowledge and capability building and capacity building that, for me, having now been on both sides of the house as a researcher and a practitioner, I have a greater appreciation for that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with Michael, and then I'm also just going to preface my ask at the end, right? As my newfound love for Baltimore. I am not a Baltimorean, not a native Baltimorean. I am a new Baltimorean. And I just find it to be such an amazing space, such an amazing city, such an amazing group of people, so resilient. And I'm always trying to figure out how I get new people to come to Baltimore and make it even more resilient and special. And so I'm going to make that ask at the end. On the front, though, we had Michael come in and work with us on a project. And for me, I've always just been about, how do I get young people in and to give them something really meaningful, not just a quick project that we can get done in a short period of time, but how do I get them to come in and really deliver and add value to something that we might carry on well after they're gone. Michael did just that, right? He came in, and while in our shop, it is more about young, old, people from all spectrums pushing back on each other and having really tough discussions. Sometimes what we think we might want to see may not be what you see. And that is the value of having an innovation team inside of your city government. All these ideas to converge, and the ideas coming from the outside. And how do we aggregate that data? How do we synthesize it? And how do we make sense of what's being said? And how do we choose the path? Sometimes not the path of least resistance, right? Sometimes we want to take on the easiest path, but sometimes the toughest path is the most impactful and beneficial path. And for that, I'm super grateful just to have really young people surrounding us, because sometimes they're not aware of the political barriers that exist. And they give you the energy and the will to move forward and push through. So Michael came through and we did really good work on just understanding. He was first coming in to help us set up the IDA, and then he viewed some of the data, and he reviewed the project of the innovation team, which is housing vacancy prevention. We immediately sent Michael out to go and work directly with developers and have conversations, work with the department, DHCD, to view the community as is. For him to understand the way he understood it, brought him back to us. Michael came back, though, when he came back with something very interesting. He started to point out some issues within the market and the investment and these LLCs and these people who owned all these properties. Couldn't really tell us if there was a pattern of one owner owning all these properties, but he could tell us that there was something going on in the market and there was some activity that may warrant some discussion. And sure enough, it did warrant some discussion, right? There was an extractive investor who had purchased quite a few properties in the city of Baltimore that was going to have quite an impact on our house. It ended up being 763 properties owned by one developer using a debt service credit ratio tool. With that, with one person, and then eventually those houses went into foreclosure. But it goes to show that the power of one person to be able to come in and see something differently and how that may change the direction of other departments. It wasn't what he came to look for, but it was something that he did point out. And the department working from the data and working also to see what was going on.
So now we're going to go to this the work of housing vacancy in the city of Baltimore. Work that the innovation team, as I said earlier, is brought in to work on housing vacancy prevention. We started off looking at holistically at housing vacancy as a whole in Baltimore. And most people, if you come to Baltimore, the first thing that catches your eye is the rows of vacant row homes. It's the thing that people see most and things that they want to tackle the most. And because that is a signal of what is happening inside of Baltimore. The innovation team kind of wanted to reframe that and understand while there is a lot of work happening on the remediation side, what are we doing to also prevent more houses from falling into further decline? What we saw in the research was that for every three houses that we brought out of disrepair, two more were in risk of falling into disrepair. Which means that the work that we were doing on the remediation side was really great and solid work, but it had been negated by these new properties falling online. So for that, we needed to do better research and to better understand how we might better resource ourselves and align ourselves to tackle that challenge. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the entire ecosystem and how we're thinking about it. So start here. Like vacancy is a signal of underlying economic disconnects. The left, you'll see this traditional view, right? Of like what people think when they think about vacancy in neighborhoods, not just Baltimore, but just urban cities in general. We see it and we instantly think vacancy, it's a liability to the city. But this diagnostic view, when you're asking yourself, what is this house telling me about this economy, the mechanisms that we have available to us? What does it say about our economy? So that diagnostic view says that, there's a policy coordination issue happening here. There's a capital flow issue. Why isn't capital making it to those underserved communities? There is a infrastructure health issue, water main, streets, potholes, bus systems, all those things that have to be in place in order for a city to be great. And so from that, we're shifting away from this traditional view of looking at every vacant house as a liability to looking at this house and asking ourselves, what is this house telling me about this neighborhood and about our economy? And from there, I'm going to tell you furthermore, like where we go from there is this viewing the built environment through the lens of economic complexity. So at the very top of that is the built environment. It is what we see. When we come to Baltimore, when we come to Philadelphia, cities like that, right? We see the vacancy in the built environment, but that is just the initial crack in what's happening. Way before that happened, there were these economic complexities, the sophistication of our economic activities that started to have a rift. And way before that, the capabilities, our know-how, our infrastructure, our institutions, they started to fail for one reason or another. Just a little bit of a lens of Baltimore. We talked about the white ale and the black butterfly. But we also hadn't really spoken about how does that happen, right? Through redlining, through issues like blockbusting. In Baltimore itself today, its market still suffers the impacts of those practices. And the neighborhoods tell the story of that. So which is why it's important for us not just to look at the built environment, but to look at the conditions that created this environment that we're seeing today. So for us, do we have the collective know-how? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the institutions in place? Are those institutions speaking to each other? Are they working seamlessly? Are they working in parallel? Are they working in sequence with trade-offs in between? I feel like one cohesive system. This complexity side is the sophistication of the economic activities in place, and can we sustain them? Cities don't just grow by happenstance; they earn growth. And by earning growth, you also have to have an eye on what it takes to sustain that growth. Because without that, you can dump a bunch of money, dump a bunch of resources into an area, but you're not able to sustain it, and then you lose all of that. So what we're doing right now is focusing not just on the built environment, but on our capabilities. How do we build up our know-how? How do we strengthen our institutions? How do we rebuild our infrastructure so that we can focus on our economic complexity and ensure that we have what we need? As a result of that, then our built environment starts to reflect what's happening at the foundation level. On this slide, we're talking a little bit about Baltimore, how Baltimore serves as a primary case study for place-based innovation. And I want to give like a huge shout out right now to our mayor, Mayor Brandon Scott, who is an amazing, of all the mayors that I've known, and there are some great mayors, he's a mascot of the city and a believer of the city. He is the city. He's like the embodiment of the city. And so he empowers the staff to take these big risks and to be bold. The first day I met him, he said, so what would be a success? He said, it's not successful unless you are swinging for the fence. You're taking these big, bold approaches. So sometimes that takes longer than what you originally planned for. And with that, though, it forced me to start thinking about how then do we take Baltimore and think about how do we improve the underlying impacts that's leading to this negative impact of this housing vacancy, and how do we build up those capacities? But first, we have to identify those capacities that needed to be built. First is this institutional coordination. So I talked a little bit about those institutions are working. Sometimes they're talking to each other. Oftentimes they're not talking to other institutions to ensure that we're working in sequence. That is a capacity that Baltimore is really intentionally working to solve and fix, and we'll go into detail about that later. Capital access. For the longest, Baltimore just didn't have the funding or the capital to actually solve its problem. We also know that capital access doesn't solve the problem on its own. You can flood an area with a bunch of money, but without having institutional coordination and the strategies in place, it doesn't materialize. And so they're also, while focusing on institutional coordination, focusing on our capital access and how do we get really creative and innovative around that. Something that I'm really, really proud of that the team has done, led by the finance department, is this non-contiguous TIF. So rethinking how TIFs work. We're used to seeing TIF bonds work as tax increment financing in ways that it focuses on like a downtown, like a contiguous area, this set area. Baltimore thought about that and how we might do this in a very different way, how we might focus on designations and certain types of properties to fund vacancies citywide, which I think was one of the first times in the US that that's been done. So you can imagine that's another bold charge brought on by Mayor Scott and the administration. The third one is something that's near and dear to my heart and what the innovation team is focused on. It's prevention capacity. How do we use data to understand where we might intervene earlier to go upstream versus the downstream impacts? What happens is if we only focus on when houses fall into severe decline, it takes a lot of time, resources, and energy to bring them back up. And that goes to, if you look at a house that's vacant, you're not just looking at a structure that's vacant, you're looking at a house that has significant liens on it, tangled titles, infrastructure issues. Plus, we wanted to make sure that we can also work with the people who were currently living in those houses, this older housing stock, and how we provide resources to them. Oftentimes, it's very difficult to get people to access the resources, and so we wanted to change that around, flip it on his head, and think about how might we look at the data that's available to us to identify properties before they fall into decline, and then how might we divert those resources to those houses to keep people in their neighborhoods. While it is great to remediate all the vacant properties and take the welcoming more people into Baltimore, you have to take care of the current people because they are the heart of the city. It is the culture. So insights, we're going to go with insight number one, this fragmentation hinders institutional coordination. We mentioned this earlier, but so the city agencies talk to each other, and then the developers talk to each other, and then the community groups talk to each other. That's great. But at some point, they all have to talk to each other. We have to understand what each other need in order for us to have a seamless system. So Baltimore itself is focused heavily on that, on things like the Baltimore Vacancy Reinvestment Council, which ties in the state and the city, the partnerships, community groups, philanthropic organizations, to make sure that this is becoming a reality. And that coordination it's a tough heavy lift, but it's also one that's very necessary. And I think Baltimore itself is ahead of the curve by understanding that in order for everyone to have what they need and everyone to be able to contribute, everyone has to be able to come to the table. And then we have to identify where we want to go. Sometimes it's consensus, most times it's just alignment on the actual goal. And then how do we divert our resources to that? The other side is that one that I'm super proud of is Reframe Baltimore. So Reframe Baltimore is how do we own all of the work that's been happening inside of Baltimore, because there's new energy, new resources, new funding. But we also need to give credit to all the work that has happened before and how is that work evolving with the new resources? How are we showing the capacities that we're building? I'll give you a quick example. Yesterday, I was in like an amazing meeting. I've been there 2 years. This is probably one of the most amazing meetings that I sat in with the team, and they were going over the acquisition pipeline. Doesn't seem super excited. It's like I'm nerding out. And it was not just about the acquisition pipeline. It was the fact that people were all in the same room looking at this very complex problem, agreeing and aligning on where the issues are and highlighting wait time, where there's wait in the system, as a step. Before, we would just skip by the step. The deputy mayor says, no, this wait time is a step because people are getting stuck here. So you highlight that, right? And everybody in the room understands that and agree, which means that if everyone is in alignment with that goal and they understand that, then everyone will put their energy towards solving that. The other side is that we've also agreed that we're not going to move past this step until we solve for this step. And now that places us in a much better position to bring in resources and partners to help us solve the problems that we are most stuck on, but for us to own the work that we are very clear on. That might have been the most clearest meeting that I've ever walked out of in the city. I was super proud of that. And I was hoping and wishing that that was recorded so that everyone could see how a city that's on the rise and that's actually trying to solve its problems should work together. So I give a huge shout out. But for them, what we're moving is from this siloed approach to a more coordinated approach. It's a tough approach. And if you want to see it in action, you can go to the Baltimore Reinvestment Council website. You can see that meeting between the state and the city and what that looks like. They're all recorded. You can understand how that's going. And you can also see the dashboards and where the progress is going. So that insight of fragmentation is hindering institutional coordination. Baltimore itself is focusing heavily on that on multiple levels to resolve that issue. Insight number 2, we have this systemic barriers block capital access in critical zones. So we realized early on that the black butterfly is where we should focus our intentional efforts. It is where we've had the greatest disinvestment. It has the highest number of vacants. Some of those areas have the highest number of new vacants. Crime, all the issues that go with what you think. Crime is like, well, I think that's one of my colleagues put it, crime and grime go together. And so you're seeing that happen in one space. But for us though, in realizing how does that, if we realize that if you just bring the money in, that doesn't help unless it's getting directly to the people that has to deliver on it. So we have this new group that the state has created, which is the Maryland Community Investment Corporation. And from the pleas of the people of hearing that now you have the money, but how do you deliver it to the hands of the people who need to deliver quickly and get moving as quick as possible? They are now working directly with the city to deliver funds directly to the community-based organizations to do the work in those investment impact areas and in our vacant priority reduction areas, geographies, which is also really, really amazing that now not just having the money, but targeting the money to where it needs to go. And then from that, having the technical assistance to work with those community-based organizations to actually be able to deliver the impacts that they want to see in their neighborhoods, which helps us get the scale and it helps us with the governor's goal of 5,000 properties in 5 years. I I mentioned this earlier, but inside of that, the non-contiguous TIF that allows us to target houses based on designations, not just one geography. That is going to give us $150 million over time, but it also does something very special for us. It helps us to bring in small developers to be a part of the conversation and be a part of the redevelopment of Baltimore versus targeting the larger developers. Gives us this chance to help build generational wealth and to set people who have been pushed out or locked out for generations into a new space. That also doesn't happen by happenstance. It happens because having a mayor with a great, bold mission and a mayor who understands their people and who is of the people, pushing it to happen and empowering people like the finance department and DHCD and the innovation team and the police department to think about things in a very different way. And so I like to say that that is also like an innovation and a prototype that's working out in our favor right now. And then insight number 3 is these reactive measures. They lag behind the need for prevention capacity. And this is something that I'm just super passionate about. Is that our current approach right now is that there's early warnings and then there's no action. We see a house like the house has high liens. This house has a 70-year-old occupant with no will probated, tax liens. Those are signals, but there's really no coordinated effort for that right now that would prevent us from tackling that. So, or the resources in that pool are so small and not coordinated enough to have the impact. So what happens is vacancy occurs and then the intervention kicks in. So house is assigned the VBN, then the intervention kicks in, and then we get into the space of reactive vacant management. Baltimore, again, thinking really deeply about its problems. Now thinking about the future capabilities that we need to build, and that's now using data to understand the early warning signs, and then to direct interventions on the front end, on the early part, and then use data-driven preventions to get us to a more resilient and stable environment. And I'm gonna take some time to like just also show the paths to vacancy. For us, we quickly realized that in order for us to go upstream, we needed to understand the upstream impacts of vacancy and how does a house fall into disrepair. And there's these 6 pathways. It's inheritance transition, legal renter viability, economics and maintenance, vacants next door, which is the contagion impact, neighborhood quality of life, and then these extractive investors. So there are the many different ways that a house could fall into vacancy, and you have to be aware of all of them. They don't happen like in sequence, so there's some special order. Sometimes you can see all 3 of them working together. You can see all 6 of them. Sometimes you may see one, and then it dovetails into the rest of the actual paths. Being very intentional about that though, and understanding what people are experiencing and what they're going through helps us to stage better interventions and bring in better resources, better partners to help us resolve those issues. We like to think that if we created something that only lived during our time in office, then we didn't do a really good job. But if we wanted it to live beyond us, then we have to bring in the partners who are certainly going to outlive the 4 years in government that were promised at the time. So the innovation team right now focus is to 3 areas, and there's 3 areas in this space. Is that we're using a predictive analytic model, developing a predictive analytic model to understand the issues that lead a house into vacancy and to catch it upstream. So we call that Know Your House, Know Your Neighborhoods. Second plank of that work is Home Repair Plus. So not just centered on the home repairs themselves, but all of the other programs and all of the other needs that you might need to stay in your house. Tax lien, you might need to have might need help with your deed, your tangled titles. There's lots of other issues. You might be elder, you might be older, so you need resources so you can age in place. All of those resources are necessary, and so we're working to develop that with partners and with the internal agency right now. And then the last piece of that would be one city prototype, which itself is shaping up to be the coordination forum for the implementers in the city. Oftentimes we have high level conversations with the executives, but then that has to get down to the people who actually do the work. And so we're asking a few questions in those type of sessions. here are the themes that are happening within this geography. What can you do to contribute to have driving an impact in this area? Uh, what do you need from us? And then what can you do to make it easier to partner with you to achieve these goals? And what we're seeing now is that from our last session is that people really like coming together and being able to share their ideas and to seek partnerships from departments where they had no idea what they did and how they may work together to coordinate across the city. To me, that is one of the that is it has taken off the quickest, and it's probably the most beneficial because you can see the joy in the faces of the employees who work hard to implement strategies and programs every day. And now they get a chance to drive the implementation of what's actually happening. And we get a chance to come back and reevaluate what's working and what's not working. We like to think of it as a learning lab. And so to get people to really lean in, it's like we're not really at this point evaluating your performance. We're validating the facilitators and the barriers to collaboration. And if we can solve for that, then the impacts come from that. And we know that they will, because we just also trust and believe that the people that we have are the right people inside of City Hall. We just need to build better pipelines for sequencing and warm handoffs and more points of collaboration. So this slide, we're talking about this. So that leads us to developing growth ready capabilities. And this is all about how do we turn vacant houses into assets, and that's going to require us to build these new capabilities, which is mechanisms that align our institutions, the financial tools that we discussed already that help reach underserved markets, which is really important. Not just the financial tools, but the financial tools that enable us to reach underserved markets, and then the data systems that predict and prevent abandonment. Super important. And if we do those properly, right? If we expand the access, if we strengthen our coordination, if we have a proactive prevention strategy, then we have these new growth opportunities that are stood up by those pillars. And this is the Baltimore context, right? We understand that Baltimore itself is a very complex area to operate. It is also one of the most resilient places that I've ever seen. It's also one of the spaces that you can't help. It's like the rocket of cities. You can't help but cheer for it, even as you see population decline. You see in 2024 that they have their first increase, very nominal, like 0.1%. But it's a signal, right, that things are moving in the right direction. So it defies the odds of what we think cities do and how they operate. And much like what we've seen with the decrease in our violent crime rate, just taking that same approach to with housing to understand how might we work to prevent things from happening in the first place, how might we strengthen our systems, how might we direct our resources to places that need it the most, then how do we involve the people who are going to be doing the work on the ground so that it not only do they have access, but they have the ability to actually execute using the resource that we have that built around their needs. All right. And so then we have the cycle, right? This goal of the place-based growth diagnostic is not just occupancy, because that would be great, but it's structural transformation. We want our neighborhoods to be places that people are proud of, that help us resolve issues, that actually move in the right direction. So this wheel shows us the cycle, right? So if you move forward with resolving your systemic gaps, then you increase your economic complexity, then you can attract new capabilities, right? And then you have this resilient development. And if you keep the eye on that this is a dynamic, just like trust, this is a dynamic to be managed. And if you want to achieve structural transformation, you have to be very intentional about where you are in that process and what you might need to strengthen your progress to the next step. So with that, you saw the presentation. It started out kind of gray. Now we're at this vibrant block of houses with tree-lined streets and tree pits and new brick and very bright, vibrant street. Focus is turning localized challenges into systemic strength. Vacancy itself, we realized from the very beginning on that view that the original view was that this is a liability. This is an issue. For us, and reframing it so that we can create a better product for the city of Baltimore and for its deserving residents, is to change that and look at this blight, that look at these abandoned properties, these vacant properties as data. what is this house telling us? And if we can translate what it's telling us, then how might we deliver on the needs of this property so that we might have better, more robust neighborhoods? So for us, while if you view it as a liability and something that you need to hide, you're never going to resolve the problem. But if you view it as a signal of what's happening below, then you won't spend all of your time and resources trying to solve for this very top area. You can go down to the different to the depths of vacancy, to the complexities of foundation by which all of our built environment stands on. This brings me to my final step, the opportunity that I mentioned earlier. This is where growth theory meets real decisions and where people trained like you can make the difference. And so for me, as a representative of Baltimore, as a new representative of Baltimore, I would like to extend the invitation for new people to review our HR website, right? Look at the many jobs that we have to come and help us be a part of this renaissance that Baltimore is having. And I can assure you it is a real renaissance as you've seen the impacts. You get a chance to work with Brandon Scott. I know we all love that. But more importantly, you get a chance to tackle persistent challenges that have lasted for a while. I had a chance to go home and do really good work. And I thought that it might be a better opportunity to take on a small piece of a larger pie than it is to take on a larger piece of a smaller pie. And in Baltimore, I feel like I'm a part of something that's much bigger, something that is just so wow that it just might happen. So for that, internships, fellowships, employment opportunities, I would look forward to having those conversations with you and welcoming you to be new residents and new visitors of Baltimore. Tim.
All right, thanks, Terrance. So we have about 15 minutes left. I just want to open the floor up and maximize the amount of questions and responses we can get, and then make sure that before Terrance flies back home or takes the train back home, people have time to follow up with him about those job opportunities and internships.
Hi, my question is regarding your appeal to the homeowners, and you said they were most engaged by the community groups. I was wondering, since they were in different situations, what worked best for the city of Baltimore? What strategy worked best when you finally got them to the meeting? What appealed for what kind of development? What really appealed to them to most? What got them to your meeting? What got them out the door?
Yeah. So I will tell you, so there's many different efforts to get people to the table. Baltimore is an engaged city. It just really is. Like, it's people believe and they love Baltimore, and they will not miss an opportunity to tell you very loudly, very passionately about how they feel about Baltimore. So a couple of things. We have our housing commissioner has office hours, right? Open office hours is coffee with Commissioner Kennedy. So that sets the tone, right? She's out there. She's out front. People are coming and having those conversations. The other side, though, is that those community-based organizations have always been around. They host their own sessions. So the city itself is out in those neighborhoods. While we do have the neighborhood sub-cabinet meetings that happen at City Hall, we're also smart enough to know that we have to go out to those neighborhoods to understand and see the nuances between neighborhoods and what people need. So the community-based organizations, they are the representatives of those groups. And so it's kind of like a funnel. You start with Allie, start with our commissioner, she's out. You start with the finance director, he's out. You have the neighborhood sub cabinets that brings you in, but then you have these opportunities where they're also going back out to gather more information. So we're taking like it's an all hands on deck approach. Some meetings are happening after 7:00 at night because that's when people are off work. Some meetings are happening during the daytime where you can actually show up to the office. And then some meetings are actually happening in spaces where it just requires the community-based organizational leaders. So what we also realize is that in order for those neighborhoods for us to get to scale, and the governor's goal of this 5,000 and the mayor's goal of rehabilitating as quick as possible, that you have to find the people, the trusted parties, who understands the nuances of those neighborhoods best. And so that is why the money goes directly to those organizations to deliver. And then they're supported by the philanthropic organizations who come together to fund the technical assistance so that we're not just handing them money, trusting that they could do it at scale, but that we're supporting them at scale. And so I wish that there was like a one answer, but Baltimore is so diverse uh, and 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 so nuanced that we have to take these nuanced approaches of how do we get people to come in and work with us. But and we're also just always refining what does that look like too.
That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your thoughts and experiences. I'm reminded I went to visit the town of Dearborn, and they were facing somewhat of a similar problem. There's significant churn in the people who live in the city. And I was taken to this part of the town that was a little bit abandoned and it was in the process of recovery. But the main investment that triggered change was that they put a mosque there. And then a lot of people who want to live near the mosque started to move in. So a mosque and some social services. And so the housing came as a consequence of wanting to be proximate to some amenity. So I was thinking, you can think of it as I need to fix the house or I need to fix something in the ecosystem that makes people want to be living in that. Have you thought about what kind of intervention would address the issue?
Yes. So in the housing plan, that's also accounted for those commercial properties. So as you can imagine, in my neighborhood, I love my neighborhood because I can get coffee, I can go to the pharmacy, I can go to the grocery store, I can get my dry cleaning done, go to a restaurant without ever having to get in the car. And so we're thinking about that as well as in the neighborhood. So we also I want to be also just super clear in our approach. While the houses are there, they're a signal of what's happening. And people are leaving because that's not there. Those other amenities are not there. So this holistic approach allows us to have those conversations with the neighbors to create their own plan. So every neighborhood is working on their own community plan with the city to explain what they want and what they want to see and what they need to have in their neighborhoods. But then also for us to get very clear and understanding what is it going to take to actually track those amenities. Where is the market allow for those things to exist? And then be very clear with the neighbors about what can come when and where. As one example of we have Johnston Square, they rebuilt the houses in the neighborhood, great neighborhood now you see it. And the neighbors, they wanted a grocery store, but the economics just didn't work for that at that time. So the space at the bottom is now like it is a library because it functions as a retail space. It still has the same behavior until we can get up to the space where they can have that. But for us, it is very intentional about what do each neighborhood want and what do they want to see? Then in what sequence can we deliver that and how do we use our financial tools to make that possible for us to have that? But yeah, you're right. The neighborhood is based on not just the housing, but people want to live where they can be a part of the community and where they can not have to leave their community in order to do certain things. And we're very, very clear about that. But we're also just very clear of the road that we have ahead of us and being clear about how do we market and communicate where things are going to happen first and what role the market plays in that. And then how do we then position ourselves? Baltimore has a great story. I think sometimes that story is combated by outsiders who may make people afraid to come and invest in Baltimore. But as you can see, like by the results of our violent crime rate, things are happening. And hopefully then that triggers people to come and want to make the investment in Baltimore as we're starting to see now.
It's something that we're working on now. So it interests me just as an example. Do you have like a certain section in your website that if I am an entrepreneur, I can just go to and tell you what I know? Or from the other hand, do you publish some kind of a challenges to say, these are our problems, tell us what you think? It's okay if the answer is no. In most places it is. I'm just interested to know.
I will not give you a no answer. I will tell you, take out your notebook. I'm going to give you something right now. It's reframebaltimore.com.
I'm going in. Thank you.
If it's wrong, come back to me. But you're gonna like this.
Nice to see you. My question is about your team and what it does within the city. So you mentioned that you are kind of a learning lab within the city. I wonder what and then you work with different departments and such, but I wonder what you're learning about what it takes to kind of drive the organization to work in a different way. You mentioned a couple of instances of where, the one city prototype and you engaged people and there was kind of a light in their eyes because, they're getting to see and be part of the implementation work. I'd love to, and you've worked in multiple cities, so I'd love your kind of thoughts on kind of what you're learning from the vantage point of somebody who is kind of driving change, organizational change internally, and what are the lessons that you're learning that would be valuable to share, both kind of on an organizational front, but with other cities.
I put my researcher hat on and I exercise my academic freedom. I will tell you it's hard, right? It's driving change in cities is very hard. What I found though is that while we like to believe that everyone can be an innovator, it's just not true. Because being an innovator, it entails that you are in a position to take a risk and be vulnerable. In most departments, if you base it on their evaluations, nothing on their evaluation says take a risk and be vulnerable. You earn more points. And so for us, more so than being a learning lab, we can also afford an opportunity to be a shield for trying new things. And so I'll give an example. We wanted to do clearboarding in the city as a part of the one city prototype. It would involve multiple departments, DPW, DHCD, police department, fire department, to work together in a way that they probably have just never done before because they just hadn't had the time or the intentionality to do so. So we kept having these conversations and we started working and we realized we were getting hung up for about 7 months of how do we get to implementation. And then our fire chief said, let's set up a demonstration. And we gathered all the parties together, might have been about 30 people. We went over to this space and they clearboarded. He went through a demonstration of what it takes to cut it with like the large saw and then what it takes to cut it with this small saw that nobody wanted to use. And the small saw was so easy. Zip, zip, zip. Everyone purchased large saws at that moment. The other side was that set the building on fire, the test building on the fire academy. Set it on fire, and now you can see clearly what we were presenting to them because we had all these presentations and these small mock-ups, but until you actually do it in front of them, frontline workers were able to see this house, this structure on fire, and I can look right through the clearboard to see and how well that held up. The next day, they went out and clearboarded 4 properties. No lie. So what I'm also, even at this point of like having worked in multiple cities, having done this for 10 years, I'm also still learning that you have to even reinvent yourself in the way you think and in the way you convey things to people. But then also understand that while I am in a privileged position to be an innovator and I have these protections and the ability to be vulnerable, my teammates who are working in agencies may not have that ability. It could be the difference between having a big, bold idea could be the difference between elevating and losing your job. And so for us, we're able to provide that lab and that space to do the research and to de-risk the opportunity to bring them in. And so sometimes what I've done on paper and what the team has done on paper may not translate to a level of comfort for them to move forward. But if we can test it really small and take on the financial risk and the implementation risk while they're doing it, and they see it, they realize that, this is something that we can really run with and go forward. And so for me, what I've really learned is patience. What I've learned is to understand what level of position I'm in, and then how do I help facilitate the risk and facilitate the level of vulnerability needed to be innovative. And then the last step is just to understand that, trust doesn't fit on a Gantt chart. And so I have to be able to create my timeline based on how people trust us. And sometimes we have to go out in front. And so for us, it is going out to the neighborhoods and taking a calculated risk to understand and observe exactly what people are saying, what they need, without an agenda. We're out there to observe only, and then to take the themes of what people are saying and then bring it back to the government and get a taste of the appetite. Like what I think may be possible may not be within your financial constraints. And then what partners do we need to bring to the table? And are we positioned to even bring a partner into this work? I think lots of times it just sounds easy just to bring partners in to work with us, but not to also understand like these people are doing work every day, and to bring someone new in changes their time span, their attention. They may not be able to deliver that. So what I've also learned is to also take full stock of what they have on their plate, and then to understand where do they need us to be a facilitator and where do they need us to be a blocker. And then how do I then take my younger staff members to teach them that also? Because I can't be it all the time, and I can't be the person to show up and ask tough questions, but then have them understand the why we have to be out, why we have to observe so closely and intentionally, why we have to come back and bring that sense of urgency on the inside. But then how do we then pair that with what is going to take to facilitate this movement in a way that gets us to a result? It's I just said that like it was easy. And I would tell you, it is hard. It is the difference between going home feeling refreshed and going home with a massive headache. But if you're outside and you're connected to the people who are actually needing what you're delivering, then you tend to push back and become more resilient. And I think that for me, unlike like my city and unlike other cities that I've been, Baltimore just has a level of grit that's been through so much that it forces you to like want to like take on that risk and help facilitate that. The other side of it is that's understanding that the innovation team has to be positioned as a helpmate and a support systems. We're behind the scene. We may not ever receive any credit for anything. If someone mentions our name one time, we'll clap for it. But the greatest value is watching people being able to live out their best ideas, their best bold ideas, and receive the credit that they have that they're so deserving of. And I think that that's what I learned the most in this journey of working in innovation, and essentially with Baltimore. I think for me, I have become probably a better leader and certainly more patient, having had this experience in Baltimore.
When I first heard about the innovation team, I imagined it was like technology and fancy things and dashboards and stuff. But then over time, as I hear more of your reflections, it's often about like a willingness to learn about something that I don't think you had any idea mattered going in, but being able to listen and steer the team toward that. Like you were mentioning clearboarding. I didn't no idea what clearboarding was until you started mentioning it so much today. Or earlier today, you were talking about the levels of the salt piles and why the levels of the salt piles weren't what they needed to be before the snow, and how you fix that for the next time. And coming from Alabama, I'm sure you didn't know about salt piles.
That wasn't my fix. That was the great people of DOT. That was their fix. Yeah, but I think it's just always been the city being able to iterate and think about things in a very different way. And I think that you have to create the culture. The right culture has to exist for people to want to be able to share their vulnerabilities and understand. It's like it takes a lot to say we're not where we need to be right now at this moment. A lot, right? Not a little. It takes a lot to do that. And so I'm always super impressed and empowered by leaders who are willing to admit where they may have miscalculated or where they went wrong and where they may do better next time, because that is innovation. And then for us, like, you're right. So while we do some technology stuff, it is really just about the people. Like whatever the people need for us to get better at their job, then we're willing to help provide that. And we also understand that every day they're involved in something. They're putting out fires all across the city. Every department is doing something really task and time consuming. What can we do to help eliminate some of those time consuming tasks, to create a new system, to create a new coordination method for them to get the level of impact that they need?
I think we're going to squeeze in one more question from Zoom.
Yeah, we have a few questions from Zoom. I'll kind of summarize them a little bit. So a couple of them are on lessons on the housing challenges for other cities. So Lakita Bowers asked about challenges with blighted properties in their city, and what do you recommend for community people to push for the things that you talked about? And then for appraisal gaps, so for example, in struggling neighborhoods, constructing a small single-family home is far greater than the market value of such homes. So how to deal with these issues? And then also the role in Baltimore of community land trusts and how that has helped resolve vacancy and housing issues.
That's one question.
It was 3 different questions that I tried to summarize.
Yeah, so I'll try to take the first one. So give me the first one again.
The first one is on blighted properties and lessons from Baltimore. Yep.
So I'll give you lessons from Baltimore, and also I'll give you lessons just from Mobile. First is to have a comprehensive inventory of your blighted structures, right? How are you actually counting those properties? And do you have a understanding of what's needed at those properties? Baltimore has a robust system of block level planning, even down to the parcels. They can tell you what's happening at each level. We didn't have that in Mobile. Baltimore really has a really amazing system that does that. And so you want to be the extra government about the tools and the systems that they have at their disposal today. Mobile, they started using pencil and paper to document blighted properties. And then we went to Instagram as a prototype. Then we went into ArcGIS collector app, which is built into the blight index that we created. That's a small city doing that work to resolve that. At the end of 4 years, had a 53% decline in housing vacancy. For a larger city, though, you want to ask those same questions. Where is our current inventory of blighted structures? What tools and resources do we have? And then how might we access those tools and resources? Because oftentimes, without those, I've come across so many cities who don't really have that level of sophistication in their data. So I think that's important. You had a land trust question.
The role of community land trusts in Baltimore to resolve these kind of issues.
Yeah, so I think it is a super coordinated effort when I think about land trust and when I think about community-based organizations and what's happening. I would say if I was going to give you one lesson from all of that, is how do we utilize the organizations who have the greatest capacity and the greatest strength to do a thing, and then how might I pair that with the next entity that might support that organization so that we have a coordinated effort across. I think for me, what I've just learned across the work and across cities and across governments is that oftentimes we hear something that happened in another city and we think that we should have that. Baltimore rejected the land bank. It worked well in Detroit. Baltimore said, we don't want a land bank. We can do this internally. And they decided to do it internally. That was an internal decision based on what Baltimore had in its capabilities and its politics and its desires. 10 years from now, we might see the impact of that, how that worked. Does that mean that Baltimore now has to take on more work internally? Yes. Are they up to it? I think they're giving it the best go that they have, and I think we're going to see positive results either way. So in that, I want to say, whether it's a land bank or a community land trust, or your internal organization taking it on, we have to ask ourselves 3 questions. And I like to go with these 3 questions because it ties back to the trustworthiness of our organization. Can you do what you say you're going to do? Can you do it without causing harm? And can you do it with the highest level of integrity possible so that I don't have to look over my shoulders and come back to community meetings over and over asking the same questions? I think if you can do that, then no matter the organization structure or type, you have a better chance at gendering the trust of the people who need to come together as your partners and help you deliver.
End it there. Thank you, Terrance.
Thank you for having me.
Everybody.